Hello, everyone. This is part one of session 23 of Pre-Socratic Still Augustine, also called History of Philosophy 1. We are now talking about the Stoics. That is the second group of Hellenistic philosophers that we turned to. We started our study of Hellenistic philosophy with Epicurus, and we looked at how he aims to improve upon pre-Socratic atomism, thereby responding to puzzles raised by Zeno from Elea, also engaging perhaps with objections raised in Aristotle. And we saw thereby how there is a kind of ongoing conversation. And that is the same kind of thing that we are also going to see now that we turn to the Stoics. The founder of Stoic philosophy, of the Stoic school, if we like, even though the word school here is an overstatement, we are more just like talking about a group of people who kind of identify with pursuing the same set of ideas. The founder of that movement is Zeno, not Zeno from Elea, but Zeno of Citium. And he spent 20 years at Plato's academy. That is an interesting fact about this new movement in philosophy, Stoicism, that its founder actually spent a lot of time kind of as we're hanging out with the people who engage closely with Plato's dialogues, Plato's successors, Plato's immediate successors, and then also somewhat later successors, because he was there in the academy for 20 years. And it is, according to the best historical evidence, a plausible assumption that in the academy, people were kind of studying Plato's dialogues in ways in which we might also study them, really as philosophers, asking, what is the theory he's laying out here or he's entertaining here? Can I accept it? If I were to accept a version thereof, what would I modify? And quite likely, Zeno's views are developed in this kind of mode, saying, here are the things in Plato that I reject. I certainly reject the forms, for example. But here are other things that I find very convincing. And Zeno and then his immediate successors are Cleanthes and Chrysippus. Those are the famous early Stoics. They develop a philosophy where a lot of what they think is ideal or the best way to live is expressed in terms of how the wise person is. And that should remind us of the beginning of Aristotle's metaphysics, where Aristotle goes through all of these intuitions for, we think the wise person knows everything. We think the wise person knows the most general things, and so on and so forth. And for Aristotle, that led to the idea that wisdom is associated with knowing first principles and causes. Now, the Stoics talk about the Sophos, the wise person, in a way that has almost a little bit an archaic ring to it. And scholars tend to think that they thereby aim to signal that they go back in time, as it were, further than Aristotle, that they don't invoke just the most recent tradition of thinking about wisdom, but really kind of very old ideas. And we can use Thales as an example for that. Thales is one of the so-called seven sages, in addition to all the other things that he is, as we discussed at the beginning of the semester. And he and other sages among these so-called seven sages, another example is Solon, they tend to have achievements that cut across a distinction between the practical and political and ethical on the one hand, and the theoretical on the other hand. They tend to be kind of really innovative thinkers in a theoretical way, but they also solve some important practical problems. They somehow, like we talked about the story that Thales had this idea during a military expedition of dividing up a river so that it is sort of like two smaller rivers and then the army could cross. So he's not just, as it were, head in the clouds theoretician. He's also a practical problem solver. And that connection between the practical and the theoretical is, according to a widespread view among scholars, an important feature of how early Greek thinkers conceive of wisdom. And the Stoics seem to go back to that. they insist that we should not come up with anything like Plato's tripartition. You may recall we discussed the distinction between three parts of the soul. And we should also not do what Aristotle does, namely say, well, in the soul there is reason proper, and then there are desires and emotions and affect which can listen to and obey reason. Rather, we should really see the soul as one. We should think, well, the mind, the soul is really just one thing. It's not like I have like several capacities in my head, as it were. The soul or the mind is one thing, and theoretical thinking and practical affairs really are one kind of thing. They are not disjoint. And to be a good person, hence, is just to be good in general. And thinking and feeling are not going to be disjunct in the way in which Plato and Aristotle presumably thought. So that position now is called psychological monism. The claim is the soul is one and virtue is one. And all the distinctions between different kinds of excellences, different kinds of good thinking, and so on and so forth, that we saw in Plato and Aristotle from that point of view are misguided. Now, your homework assignment is to come up with at least one phenomenon, either something relating to virtue or to the emotions or to thinking, where you can see the reason behind saying, well, no, it is a mistake to say that desire and reason are disjoint. Rather, we need to think of them as integrated in one unified soul.